And so we'll talk about operations modeling. So we'll start off with possibly one of the most famous operations models, but also a project modeling technique that quite a few of you possibly use. And if not, if you use it, it'll be perhaps a little bit of refresher, and maybe I can learn a bit from you too. And if not, it should be something that would give you some degree of insight and be useful in whatever you do in the future. So PERT basically started with the US Navy when it was building its Trident missiles. It wanted to make sure, because the military is famous for going over time and over budget, which of course ends up costing taxpayers a lot of money. So they wanted to make sure that, hey, we want to try and tie everything that we have within using a certain very solid framework, a template, but it's going to be defined by a well orchestrated process set, right? And we'll talk about things like milestones and deliverables, but all this is, PERT stands for Program Evaluation and Review Techniques, right? So it's basically how to evaluate a program and how to review the basic techniques behind it. So I'll show you a few PERT diagrams, but it basically is nothing but a series of chain-linked nodes, one after the other. So in this case, so let's look at this one, the one that's right out here. So what it's doing is this is basically the schedule, right? And if you're, whether you currently practice it or planning on practicing it, it's very straightforward. All you do is you create the sequence of things that define your process. As simple as that. Start at a level of higher abstraction, which is this is what it does, and then this is what it does, and then this is what it does. Then go into serious depth for each of them, till you find things where you know exactly where to implement a resource, where to schedule a resource, and also where to schedule costs and time. Now, of course, we've talked about this many a time. Cost and time are always high correlated, so it's important to make sure that if you're using cost, you can convert that into time. If you're using time, you can convert that into cost. So going forward, assume this is our product design setup, right? And these are the tasks or the activities that you do under the whole set, so in the whole process. So it begins with activity A. So you always start numbering it. It could be 1, could be A, B, C, D, however way you want to go, it's perfectly fine. So the first one is you start by saying we develop product specifications. And how long will that take? You say it's going to take 4 weeks. Does it have a predecessor? Is that the beginning one? And you say, yes, it is, which means it doesn't have a predecessor. Second one is, say, activity B, which follows that. You start by designing the manufacturing process, but it needs the product specifications to be developed before you can move forward with it. And that will take 6 weeks. After that is activity C, which is source and purchase materials, which also needs A, which means that 2 activities suddenly both need A, which means that both of them run in parallel. Whenever you've got 2 similar predecessors, you know that they basically are running in parallel. This requires 3 weeks. Then you source and purchase tooling and equipment. For that, you need to design your manufacturing process first, and the duration is 6 weeks. Then you receive and install tooling and equipment, which requires D, which is source and purchase tooling and equipment, which takes 14 weeks. After that, you receive your materials, which requires C, and C is source and purchase materials, and it takes 5 weeks. And then you've got you start your piloting, requires both E and F in order to get it completed. Now this is, in this case, This is an example of divergence. This is an example of convergence, where suddenly you need two things done before you can start piloting your production run. What do you need done? E and F. Firstly, you need to receive and install tooling and equipment, and then you also need to receive materials, right? So you need to have both of them done before you can start that. That takes 2 weeks. Then you evaluate your product design, which requires G, and G is you need to first do your pilot production run, and that takes 2 weeks. Evaluate process performance, which also requires G. Again, these are two things in parallel, and it takes 3 weeks. After that, you write your documentation report, which requires H and I, which are evaluate product design and evaluate process performance. That takes 4 weeks. And finally, you transition to manufacturing, which requires J, which is post documentation, and takes 2 weeks. Right now, if you look at it, it's very straightforward. All you're doing is simply saying, what are the steps that we need to do in order to get something done? So it doesn't matter if it's services, doesn't matter if it's production, doesn't matter if it's some kind of information exchange, right? And after I heard that you're taking money and capital markets, I decided that, well, might as well try and build some synergies. So I added a few slides later on that will sort of link this process reengineering with money and capital markets too, because that's a lot of operational planning and operational reengineering is going on in money and capital markets. So once you have these steps defined, you know what you need to get done before you can do the next step, and you know how long each takes. Then this one oftentimes does not tell you what resources you need. So if you actually need any resources, you could simply say, I also want to see what resources it requires. So you could have resource one, let's say resource one, resource two. And if you say, we're going to need resource 1 and 2 for 4 weeks, you know how much resource 1 costs for each week, you know how much resource 2 costs for 1 week or 4 weeks, and you can immediately calculate that. For example, if you say, all right, we're going to need resource 1 gets paid $120,000 a year, and resource 1 works for 40 weeks every year, then immediately you can say that, all right, 40 weeks, $120,000, right? So you immediately know exactly how much they are. You can charge them they're priced. That's your typical chargeback. And a chargeback is nothing but, you all know this better than I do, a chargeback is nothing but any time you sequester a resource for the purposes or process for a purpose or a material for a purpose, and then you're going to relieve it, you'll have to pay a chargeback. That itself is, once upon a time, it used to be much more ill-defined setup called transfer pricing, but now the chargebacks are much better because then you can divvy your fixed costs across multiple different departments. So going back to it, so what you're doing here is you're starting by saying, we begin with A. After A, it diverges into B and C. Once we get B and C done, D depends on B, E depends on D, F depends on C. Once E and F are completed, only then can we begin G. Once G is completed, then we can pass out the work to H and K, which can be done in parallel, but H and K both need to be completed before we can begin J. Once J is completed, then the end run is on K. So that's exactly what it is. Once you've got that, then the thing is, you've started building your PERT model. but it also gives you something in terms of understanding four particular parameters. One is called earliest finish and earliest start, or early start and early finish, and latest finish and latest start. Now, there's an important thing to understand about it. The reason why these are important is early finish and late finish basically tells you this is the maximum allowable timeline for the project or for each activity. If we don't complete it, then we're going to run into over budgeting and over timing, right? Earliest start, on the other hand, is basically telling you when can we start the earliest and when can we start the latest. That tells you something called, do we have any kind of slack, right? We're talking about, do we have any kind of slack whatsoever? So let's look at whether we can figure that out. So let's start off with activity A. So for each of them, the question is, what is the earliest start? What's the latest start? What is the earliest finish? What's the latest finish? Now, if you look at it closely, you'd say, well, this is the very first one. So the earliest start, because it's the origin bit, is day 0 or week 0 in this case, right? So it starts, the earliest you can begin is right now. How long does it take to do it? So it takes 4 weeks to complete it. And therefore, you know that your earliest finish is 4 weeks. Now, you don't worry about the latest start and latest finish first. So this is known as, we'll go something called a forward propagation. And your latest start and latest finish will be something called a backward propagation. So we'll only figure out the early start, early finish first. So you can only begin A, week 0, and finish A, week 4. After A finishes, can you begin B and C? Now, activity A, or task A in this case, requires nothing as a predecessor, but B and C both require A to be completed. The earliest A can finish is week 4, which means B and C can only begin week 4. And that's why you'll see for B and C, the early start is week 4. Now, how long does B take? It takes 6 weeks. How long does C take? C takes 3 weeks, right? So you're saying B begins only when A ends. It takes 6 weeks, so the earliest B can finish is 10 weeks, which is nothing but begins at 4, 6 more weeks to finish it. That means that latest finish is week 10. On the other hand, for C, it also needs A, which means it begins week 4, but it requires 3 weeks to complete it, which means it's 7 weeks till the end, or the earliest it can finish, right? The earliest it can finish is 7 weeks. Does that make sense? Just the basic set. I hope it does. You can just give me a show of hands or whatever it is. All right. Thank you very much. Sweet. So now, thank you, TJ. Thank you, Stellas. Thank you, Ken. So once you're moving forward, thank you, Lucia. So as we're moving forward, anything that depends on the previous one, the latest finish or the earliest finish of the previous one becomes the earliest start of the next one. So in this case, because D depends on B, the earliest B can finish is week 10, which means the earliest D can start is week 10. It takes for D to be completed 6 weeks, which means the earliest it can finish is week 16. Then you've got E out here, which takes 14 weeks, and it can only start when D has finished, and the earliest D finishes is week 16, and then it starts, takes 14 weeks. Earliest it finishes is therefore 14 plus 16, which is 30. And you know that that's 30 weeks. On the other hand, for F begins only when C ends. C ends week 7. That's the earliest finish for C. So earliest F can start is going to be week 7. It takes 5 weeks to do that. And then earliest finish is week 12. So you know that this is an important time for us to take a bit of a breather and understand this bit. So now we're going to head into G. G requires both E and F to be completed. F has been completed. The latest F can finish. The earliest F can finish is week 12. The earliest G can finish is week 30. That tells you that suddenly this task finishes about 18 weeks prior to this task, which means if you, as an executive or a manager, you're deciding on resource costing, you know that F will be done 18 weeks prior to G, which means that you can now schedule your resources strategically and say that I don't need the resources that I would have used for F for 18 straight weeks. Now you can schedule it later on, getting closer to G's timeline, or in this case, to E's timeline, and then say that, well, I'm not going to just get the resources and just pay them for 18 weeks for doing nothing. I can either decide on it as start, get it done early and leave it there, or get it done later and wait. Now, I'm a big fan of, I would rather have, C and F start later, because I don't like keeping inventory on the set unless you're actually using the inventory. So I would say push that forward. You've got 18 days extra out here, and in this case you have 3 days compared to 6 days, so another 3 days extra out here. You now have 21 days slack for C and F before you need G to start. This 21 days is also 21 days of resource savings, right? So this is 21 days of savings, and how you strategize is going to be completely up to you. I like to push it back, but of course there's a cost of pushing it back, which is in case things don't work well and something goes wrong, everything else is likely to be delayed too. So you could decide on how you want to play around with the variance. And I'll talk about how we get these numbers and so forth, but that's going to be in the next slide. So let's move forward. So now G requires both E and F in order to get started. E finishes week 30, while F finishes week 12. So G can only begin when E finishes, which is 30, right? You have to take the highest of competing sets because, frankly speaking, E, you can't choose anything less than 30 because it's going to take E 30 weeks to complete its activity or its task nonetheless. So once G is done, then what you're doing is you're evaluating your project design and you're evaluating your process performance at the same time. And it branches out again. So you've got H and I, which both require G. Once you've got that, what you're simply doing is you're saying these two can be run in parallel. H takes 2 weeks to complete. Process performance evaluation takes 3 weeks to complete, which also means that process design evaluation has 1 extra week of savings. Again, how you strategize on using that is going to be up to you. But say early start for H and I would be, it can only start when it's, what is it? It's 32 because G takes 2 weeks. Takes 2 weeks to complete it. So earliest finish is 34. On the other hand, for I, starts 32, takes 3 weeks, which is 35, and can only finish week 35. However, J at that point requires both H and I to be completed in order to begin. This will only finish week 35. This will finish week 32. So you have to wait for week 34. So you have to wait till week 35 to come through before you can begin. So the earliest start for J is week 35, takes 4 weeks, which means the earliest you can finish is week 39. And then finally, K approaches. K can only begin when J has been completed, which is week 39. Takes 2 weeks to complete it, which means week 41. Once you've done it, now, firstly, you know that it's going to take you 41 weeks to complete the entire project. There are some tasks in between where resource needs have more slack, which means you also have more budgetary slack. There are also some down where you don't have any kind of slack. Now, this 41 weeks is crucial because that's also where we start figuring out our latest start, latest finish, and latest start by doing a backward calculation. Everybody clear to this point? All right, perfect. Everybody okay? If any questions, please let me know, though. Thank you guys, thank you. All right, so moving forward, so you've got 41 weeks. From 41 weeks, you now start something called a back propagation. So you say, all right, the latest you can finish is 41 weeks. If you can finish, this is nothing but reverse engineering, right? So you possibly practice it, or at least if you heard of it, this is how it's done. This is reverse engineering. So you're trying to figure out, how do we create your project timeline based on reverse engineering? We want to finish the project in 41 weeks. What do we need to get done? So 41 weeks, which means the latest you can start in order to maintain the 41-week timeline is 39, because it takes 2 weeks to run it, which means that the latest J can finish is going to be 39 weeks, and the latest can start, because it takes 4 weeks, is 35. So the latest can start is 35. Now you'll see the same numbers out here. So the latest, which means H can finish and I can finish, it would be week number 35. And the latest I can start, because it takes 3 weeks, would be week 32, which is 35 minus 3. And the latest H can start would be week 33, because it takes 2 weeks, right? So this one takes 3 weeks. All you're doing is latest finish minus the number of weeks it takes to complete the job, left with latest start. Then here's this interesting thing. So the latest this one can finish is week 32. The latest H can finish is week 33, right? Which means that the lower of the number, right, week, in this case, week 32, is the latest that this one needs to be done in order to start. So, which is G, needs to choose the lowest number. So the key is whenever you're backward propagating and if you have multiple parallel processes, choose the one with the lowest number as the latest start, as the latest finish for the previous one. And whenever you're doing a forward propagation, look for the highest number for latest finish to do the earliest start. And that makes sense too, because if you also think of it, you need all activities done before you can start the next one. And when you're backward propagating, you're saying in order to keep everything tight in schedule and create the right slack, you want to figure out when is the lowest latest start between two projects so that you can prepare that so that they can start right after you've completed it. Because if you take a longer time, then it creates a problem, right? So if you, because, without cluttering the place any further, let's look at this table. So you've got all these activities. It's basically saying this is the time when this is your latest finish for each. This is your earliest finish for each. The difference between late finish and early finish is something called a slack. This slack is your savings. This is your savings mainly because you don't want to use up a resource if it's not needed. Very much like practicing lean operations, like an on-demand setup, just the way we do on calls with a lot of people, whether we're talking about Uber, which basically means a driver only works when there is a passenger that requires him or her to work. A nurse might only go to work, or a surgeon might only go to work only when there is a particular requirement for that particular staffing or that resource being staffed. Otherwise, you let it free so that you don't have to pay a chargeback for that particular resource. So as you start looking at it, this says A, late finish is for, early finish is for, which means the slack is 4 minus 4 is 0. B, on the other hand, is also very, sorry, not on the other hand, B is also very similar. Latest finish is 10 weeks, and early finish is 10 weeks, which means it has 0 slack. C says latest finish is 25 weeks, and earliest finish is 7 weeks, which means it has 18 weeks of slack. So resources needed for activity number C, you have 18 weeks of free resource timing where you can choose when to use them and when to also let them go. D, on the other hand, has 0 slack. E has 0 slack. F has 18 weeks of slack. G has 0 slack. H has 1 week of slack. I has 0 slack. J has 0 slack, and K has 0 slack. Now the ones that have a 0 slack mean something very important, which is these activities are crucial to, it's crucial that we manage them well in our entire project, because we can't afford having them run over time and thus over budget. Because if they run over time and over budget, everything else is going to move up the schedule and therefore is going to become massively over budget, right? And there's an amplification room. So anytime one small issue happens, it just gets amplified over time. So this set of pieces that define what are the ones that don't have any resource slack oftentimes are the pieces in something called the critical path, right? So the critical path, all activities on the critical path will have 0 slack. And slack defines how long non-critical activities can be delayed without delaying the product. And of course, we calculated slack is the activities late finish minus its early finish. And of course, quick recap, earliest start is the earliest finish of the immediate preceding activity. Earliest finish is the earliest start plus the activity time. Latest start and latest finish. Latest an activity can start or finish without delaying the project completion. So I know that was a bit of information to take in right in the very first slide, but I'm going to give you a minute to sort of breathe in and see if you want to ask me any questions. Is everybody good to go?
Good, good.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Dave. Now, how many of you use something like a process modeler? Something like a PERT? Okay, yes. So MS Project is a very famous Microsoft project tool that's used because this allows you, this oftentimes is used in conjunction with something called a Gantt chart, Gantt. And a Gantt chart is nothing but it's a scheduled timeline. It very much looks like your Outlook calendar, where you've got when does this work, when does that not work, and I understand both Stella and Dave end up using these similar to Microsoft project, but it's quintessential because unless you know what the exact processes are, or Smartsheet, yes. Now I think Smartsheet is completely online, Robbie, is it? Yes, right. So Smartsheet's very good, but these are all mechanisms to create a full process model, because then you know what research do you. Now you can use these. Do realize these don't have to be in weeks. These can be in seconds, in milliseconds. For example, I once did some work with a company that was building a fintech investment setup. There, the trade closes and order closes and order fulfillment were all defined in milliseconds. But the millisecond markers were extremely important because they wanted to work off momentum trades. So a momentum trade is when, going back to capital markets, is when you realize that for example, Tesla's Cybertruck is getting a lot of very good press. And because it's getting very good press, even though it's likely to be released in 2021 and 2022, there's a likelihood that Tesla's stock is going to gain momentum because of this good press. Now, as it gains momentum, which means more and more analysts are likely to move it from a hold to a buy. And as they're moving it from a hold to a buy and more pieces are coming in from every place, such as Barron's to Seeking Alpha, people are saying, yes, maybe we should put a part of our pension fund into Tesla. Maybe we should put a part of our hedge funds, or maybe we should add or a greater percentage for Tesla in our mutual funds or in our ETFs. What you're doing is you're creating a buy focus. On the other hand, if somebody says, I don't think Macy's didn't have a very good season this Cyber Monday and Black Friday, and I don't think Macy's is going to do very well, or Kohl's is going to do very well. So there's a negative momentum trade. What systems then end up doing is they end up they end up predicting which way the momentum is heading. Is it a negative momentum or is it a positive momentum? And before the positive momentum actually builds up, they want to use milliseconds to place large orders, and as the momentum builds up, they'll clear those orders, which means they'll sell it. So think of it today early morning. pre-market, not today, today's Saturday, but pre-market, suppose Friday, good news comes out of Tesla. The whole idea is create possibly 1,000 millisecond high frequency trade orders that would work, that would fill up the entire process of filing, ordering, and closing transactions before the market opens and stays open for the next 10 minutes, where a lot of people and a lot of funds will start buying. So what you're doing is what these HFTs, the high frequency trades, will do would be in fintech, they'll fill these orders as fast as they can, and by the time the entire market is going bonkers, they've already worked the momentum, made a neat bit of money, and then exited the set. And that's what they do. So they end up creating these same processes in terms of get this news out of Bloomberg first, manage these news, figure out what the momentum is, predict how long the momentum is going to be sustainable, create a trading point, create a limit ordering point, figure out when to close what the pricing should be for the limit and what the latest closing is, make sure you create a stop loss and then put in the order. And that's what they do. So that would be nothing but the process for running a capital market setup. So moving forward to the next one. So where do we get these times from? Because put in all these times, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, where on earth do we get these times from? Whether it's for milliseconds, 6 milliseconds, or for months, 6 months, or 2 days. Now, of course, if you're practicing something like Scrum or Agile, your timeline is going to be tighter because you want quicker deliverables, smaller solutions, and much more modular approaches. So modular is basically you want things that can work on their own, but you can still be able to fathom some kind of performance, right? So it's something that you can actually measure if it was doing well or not. So you try to break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks. But then you also know that if things go a bit awry, you can fix them early on rather than waiting for a longer piece. So you don't have to get into the general math of it, but it follows something called a beta distribution. And a beta distribution has the parameters, 3 parameters. One is what is the most optimistic time that you could get done, most likely time, which is going to be your average time, and your most pessimistic time. So suppose you say, all right, I want to say, how long does it take for a hospital to receive and check in a patient? And you say, optimistically, if everything is there, we have the patient's electronic medical records and everything, it would take the least time it would take would be possibly, 3 minutes. On average, it takes about, so let's say it takes 3 minutes. And on average, it takes about 10 minutes. And pessimistically, if things are up to spiff and there's too much of a backlog, it's likely to take 18 minutes. I'm just making up these numbers. So the beta distribution is nothing but 3 plus 4 times 10, which is 43. 43 and 18. 43 and 18 is what? 61. So 61 divided by 6, which is going to be 10.16 or something like that. I really don't know, but I think it's going to be something like 10.16, right? So you say that it's likely to be, am I even saying it properly? So 43, 43 and 18, 10.16. So that is, so you'd say that patient check-in procedure is going to take 10.16 minutes. Now the way this is set is the beta distribution basically says, you're going to divide it into 6-point scale. will only say one part is optimistic. The main part, which is the four of them, is the average, and then one part is pessimistic. So this area is your 4 times, and then this is your optimistic time, and this is your pessimistic time. And because you've got 6 pieces, you divide it by 6, and that's it. Now the important thing to know about this is nothing but the very fact that if you're ever dealing with an activity that might have a lot of uncertainty, so if you are dealing with an activity that has a lot of uncertainty, you would change this equation. More uncertainty means more weight on pessimism, less weight on optimism, and less weight on most likely. So in this case, you might say, so the high uncertainty, you might say same bit, right? 3 plus 10, but instead we'll add a higher weight or a greater weight to the pessimistic set. Now, I can't even tell you how important, or I can't even begin to explain to you how important that is, because this, how long you plan. Now, think of how this changes it. So 4 times 18 is how much? 40, 70. So 72 and 10 is 82, 82 and 3 is 85. So 85 divided by 6. Can somebody help me? How much is 85 divided by 6? 60, 14, I suppose 14.16 or something like that. Thank you, Ben. 14.16. So 14.16. Now look at how it changed. 10.16 versus 14.16. Now, if you are ever dealing with activities within the set, for example, Ben was kind enough to mention, and congratulations on joining Goodyear, that we're planning on, or as Goodyear is planning on consolidating a lot of its infrastructure and resources and everything. A big part is this consolidation itself is an operational project. When you're dealing with this consolidation, there are many different pieces of the consolidation, right? There's a lot of buy-ins going on, a lot of lock-ins going on, a lot of integration points going on, a lot of middleware being built, and so on and so forth. When you're doing these, each part happens in a sequence, very much like the way we planned out the PERT. Now, when you hit an activity that you aren't very sure of, you don't want to follow this setup, because this assumes that you'll work on the average. But the higher the uncertainty, this is purely my humble opinion, add greater weight to a more pessimistic set, because in this case, if this were, I suppose, 14.16 minutes, you will be budgeted for 14.16 minutes versus being budgeted for 10.16 minutes, which means you'll still have another 4 extra minutes of budgeted resources that you have accumulated, just in case things go wrong. So anytime you're dealing with things where you're wondering, can things go wrong? I really don't know. We haven't tried this before. We haven't examined this properly. There are too many pieces of the puzzle. Add more weight to the pessimistic side. Now, of course, the weight doesn't have to be exactly 1, 1, and 4. It could very well be 0.5, 0.2, and then 5.3, right? So you could, as long as the sum of all of them is equal to 6, right? So however way you want to add it. Maybe you don't want to have anything that is an optimistic. You only want to have what's the median, or sorry, what's the mean or the median in this case, and what's the more pessimistic set. So choose your timing carefully because we all are held to the schedule that we pass on. And any time we create too much, I believe in um, always try to deliver more, right? Don't get too cocky. Try to deliver something better than what they were expecting you to deliver. But in that case, make sure that you're automatically bringing in or factoring in uncertainty for certain things. Not everything in life is likely to go as planned. Sometimes it's brilliant, but sometimes you get a little bit of uh, unexpected turbulence. And the question is, how do you factor in this unexpected turbulence? So calculating this time is very important. Sh any questions, or else should we take a break for 5 minutes?